The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's training facility as Delta Force's most elite snipers prepared for another day of precision training. The air was thick with humidity and testosterone, a combination that had become as familiar as the weight of their weapons. Among the assembled warriors stood Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran with over 200 confirmed kills across 3 theaters of war. Former Navy SEAL Jack Thompson, whose weathered face told stories of countless covert operations, and a dozen other battle-hardened soldiers who had earned their places among America's most lethal marksmen. That's when they saw her walking across the compound. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell moved with quiet confidence through the morning mist, her blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun that caught the early sunlight. Her blue eyes seemed to catalog every detail around her as she approached, taking in the layout of the training facility, the positions of the men, the equipment scattered across the tables. At 28 years old and 5'7", with an athletic build, she carried her standard-issue gear with an ease that should have impressed the watching soldiers, but instead only fueled their skepticism. "Well, look what the Pentagon sent us," Rodriguez muttered to Thompson, adjusting his faded baseball cap. "Another diversity hire who probably thinks Call of Duty counts as combat training," Thompson chuckled, spitting tobacco juice into a paper cup. $20 says she can't even shoulder that rifle without the recoil knocking her flat on her ass. "Make it interesting," called out Corporal Danny Bullseye Martinez from behind his Barrett M82, the massive anti-material rifle that had earned him his nickname in Iraq. "I bet $1,000 she can't hit anything beyond 500 meters. Hell, I bet she can't even properly sight a target without asking for help." The group of elite soldiers erupted in laughter, their voices carrying across the morning air with the casual cruelty of men who had seen too much combat to care about political correctness. They'd witnessed this scenario before, politicians pushing agendas, sending soldiers who looked impressive on recruitment posters but crumbled under pressure when real lives hung in the balance. Sarah heard every word. She always did. Growing up in a military family had taught her to listen, to observe, to let others reveal their assumptions before showing her hand. "Gentlemen," came a commanding voice from behind them. Colonel James Harrison, their commanding officer, approached with purposeful strides, Sarah walking calmly at his side. Harrison was a legend in his own right, a man who had personally selected each member of this elite unit. "Meet Lieutenant Mitchell. She'll be joining your unit for advanced marksmanship evaluation." "Sir," Rodriguez stood at attention, though his smirk remained fixed in place. "We were just discussing training protocols with the lieutenant." "Is that so?" Colonel Harrison's steel-gray eyes narrowed as they swept across the group. He'd heard the chatter from his office window, and he knew his men well enough to read the situation. "Well, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate these protocols. Lieutenant Mitchell, the men seem eager to see what you can do." Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm and clear as mountain air. "I couldn't help but overhear Corporal Martinez's wager, sir. If he's so confident in his assessment, perhaps we could make it official." Martinez's grin widened, revealing teeth stained by years of tobacco use. "You want to take that bet, sweetheart? $1,000 says you can't hit a man-sized target at 500 meters, let alone anything that would impress this crew." "Let's make it more interesting," Sarah replied, her blue eyes never leaving his. "2,000 says I can do something none of you have ever seen before." The compound went dead quiet. Even the usual morning sounds, birds chirping, distant traffic from the main base, seemed to fade away. Colonel Harrison raised an eyebrow, curious despite himself. "What exactly did you have in mind, Lieutenant?" Harrison asked. Sarah gestured toward the distant mountain ridge that bordered the training facility, its peaks still shrouded in morning mist. "See that communications tower at 2,800 meters? Someone place a beer bottle on the fence post next to it. I'll shatter it with a single shot." The silence that followed was deafening. 2,800 meters was beyond extreme range for most rifles and shooters. The longest confirmed sniper kill in history was 3,540 meters, achieved under perfect conditions with specialized equipment and a target that had been stationary for hours. This was a woman they'd assumed couldn't handle basic marksmanship training. "That's impossible," Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible. "The bullet drop at that distance, wind calculations, atmospheric conditions, even with our best equipment and perfect conditions." "Double or nothing," Sarah interrupted quietly. $4,000 total. "But I have one condition." "Name it," Martinez said, though his confidence was already beginning to waver. "When I make this shot, you all owe me more than money. You owe me respect. And you owe me the courtesy of never again assuming what someone can or cannot do based on their appearance." Colonel Harrison made a radio call, and within 20 minutes, a Humvee had made the treacherous journey to the distant ridge and back. The driver confirmed what they needed to know. An empty beer bottle now sat perched precariously on the fence post beside the communications tower, barely visible even through high-powered spotting scopes. Sarah approached the equipment table with deliberate care, her movements fluid and economical. She examined each available rifle, with the attention of a master craftsman selecting tools. She passed over the standard M24 sniper weapon system, the M82 Barrett that Martinez favored, even the specialized shatter M200 intervention that boasted incredible long-range capabilities. Finally, her hand settled on a rifle that made the entire group exchange uncertain glances. The Accuracy International AX-50, chambered in .50 BMG. It was a weapon that demanded respect, capable of incredible precision but requiring expertise that few possessed. Interesting choice, Colonel Harrison observed, his military bearing unable to fully conceal his growing curiosity. That's a serious piece of equipment. It's the only one that'll do what I need at this distance, Sarah replied, beginning her setup with movements so fluid and practiced that the mocking whispers gradually died away. She didn't just set up the rifle. She transformed the shooting position into something approaching a work of art. Her calculations weren't hastily scribbled on paper like the others typically did. Instead, she seemed to feel the wind patterns, taste the air pressure changes, read the heat shimmer rising from the distant mountainside, like an ancient language only she understood. Current wind speed? She asked quietly, not looking up from her preparations. 3.2 miles per hour, southwest, Rodriguez answered automatically, then caught himself. He'd been watching her work with growing fascination, forgetting to maintain his skeptical facade. Sarah's fingers moved across the scope adjustments with surgical precision, making micro-adjustments that would have taken most snipers 15 minutes of intense computation. She was performing calculations that existed at the very edge of ballistic science, and she was doing it by instinct developed over years of practice. "Who trained you?" Thompson found himself asking, his voice stripped of its earlier mockery. "My father," Sarah replied without looking up from the rifle. "Carlos Hathcock was his instructor during the Vietnam War. Before that, my grandfather taught me to shoot when I was 7 years old in the mountains of Montana." The name Hathcock sent a visible chill through the assembled group. Carlos Norman Hathcock II was legendary among military snipers. 93 confirmed kills in Vietnam, holder of the longest confirmed kill record for over 30 years. A man whose exploits had become the stuff of military folklore. "Hathcock's been dead for decades," Martinez said suspiciously, though his voice lacked its former confidence. 23 years this past February, Sarah confirmed, still making minute adjustments to her scope. "My father learned from him in 1975, right here at Fort Bragg actually. Hathcock was instructing advanced marksmanship before his multiple sclerosis forced him to retire. I learned from my father. Some lessons passed down through generations, getting stronger with each transfer of knowledge." As Sarah continued her preparations, the enormity of what she was attempting began to sink in among the watching soldiers. At 2,800 meters, the physics involved were staggering. The .50 caliber bullet would experience a drop of nearly 800 inches, over 66 feet, during its flight time of approximately 4.2 seconds. Wind drift could push the projectile dozens of feet off target if not calculated perfectly. Temperature variations, altitude differences, even the Coriolis effect from Earth's rotation would influence the bullet's trajectory. Most snipers would spend hours calculating such a shot, using ballistic computers and weather monitoring equipment. Sarah was doing it all by feel, by instinct, by knowledge passed down through 3 generations of exceptional marksmen. Her grandfather, William Mitchell, had been a legendary hunter and competitive shooter in Montana. Her father, Staff Sergeant David Mitchell, had been one of the Army's most respected sniper instructors before his death in Afghanistan when Sarah was 16. "The wind's shifting," Rodriguez observed, his professional interest overriding his skepticism. "Southwest to west. Southwest picking up to maybe 4 miles per hour. Sarah nodded without looking up. "I can feel it. There's also a thermal current rising from that rock face at about 2,200 meters. It'll push the bullet up about 6 inches if I don't compensate." Thompson blinked in surprise. He'd been studying that same ridge through his spotting scope and hadn't noticed the thermal distortion. This woman was reading atmospheric conditions like a weather station, but with an intuition that no machine could replicate. The rifle setup was finally complete. The massive AX-50 looked almost comically large in Sarah's hands, but she handled it with the familiarity of someone who had been doing this her entire life. The bipod was perfectly positioned, the rifle cant adjusted to the precise angle needed for the extreme range shot. Her shooting mat was positioned to account for the slight uphill angle of the target. Range confirmed at 2,847 meters, called out Sergeant First Class Williams from behind his laser rangefinder. "Jesus, that's almost 3 kilometers. The bottle was barely visible even through the most powerful scopes, appearing as nothing more than a tiny glint of reflected sunlight against the mountainside. At that distance, the margin for error was measured in fractions of degrees. A mistake of even 1 millimeter in aim point could result in a miss by several feet. Sarah settled into her shooting position with movements that seemed choreographed. Her body alignment was perfect, creating a stable platform that would absorb the massive recoil of the .50 caliber rifle. Her breathing slowed to a rhythm that would have impressed a yoga instructor, each breath deep and controlled, preparing her body for the precise moment when she would need absolute stillness. Through her scope, she could see the bottle clearly now, a small cylindrical target perched precariously on the fence post. The crosshairs wavered slightly with her breathing, but with each exhale, they settled more precisely on target. She was entering what her grandfather had called the zone, that mystical state where shooter, rifle, and target became one unified system. The watching soldiers had gone completely silent. Even Colonel Harrison found himself holding his breath, despite having witnessed thousands of training exercises over his career. There was something different about this moment, something that transcended mere marksmanship and entered the realm of the extraordinary. Sarah's breathing slowed even further. Her heart rate dropped to what felt like barely 40 beats per minute, a physiological response that few people could achieve without years of training. The world narrowed to nothing but the crosshairs in her scope, the tiny glint of glass nearly 3 kilometers away, and the perfect stillness that existed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Wind conditions were optimal. The thermal currents had stabilized. Atmospheric pressure was steady. Every variable that could be controlled or calculated had been accounted for. Now it came down to the intangible elements: instinct, experience, and the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of exceptional shooters. The crosshairs settled on the bottle with mechanical precision. Sarah's finger found the trigger, applying pressure with the delicate touch of a surgeon. The trigger break would be clean and crisp, sending the massive .50 caliber projectile downrange at over 2,800 feet per second. Time seemed suspended. The morning air was perfectly still, as if nature itself was holding its breath for this moment. Sarah exhaled slowly, letting her lungs empty completely, then paused in that perfect moment of respiratory stillness that all precision shooters sought. The trigger broke like glass. The massive rifle erupted with a thunderous roar that echoed across the compound and into the distant mountains. The recoil, which should have been punishing for someone of Sarah's size, was absorbed perfectly through her stance and technique. She rode the recoil like a surfer riding a wave, maintaining perfect follow-through as the rifle settled back into position. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. At 2,800 meters, the bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach its target. Sound would take another 8 seconds to return, creating a period of agonizing suspense that tested everyone's nerves. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Rodriguez counted under his breath: 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Thompson had his spotting scope trained on the distant ridge. Though he knew he wouldn't be able to see the bullet impact at that range, Martinez stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, perhaps beginning to realize that he might have just witnessed something unprecedented. Then, impossibly, they heard it. A distant crash of shattering glass that carried across the morning air like the sound of breaking crystal. The bottle had exploded in a shower of glass fragments that caught the morning sunlight like tiny diamonds before falling to the ground around the fence post. Rodriguez was the first to raise his binoculars to his eyes. "No fucking way," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Thompson grabbed his spotting scope, adjusting the focus frantically. "Jesus Christ, it's gone. The bottle is completely gone." Martinez just stood there, mouth open, staring at the distant ridge where the beer bottle had been sitting moments before. "Confirm the target," Colonel Harrison ordered, though his voice betrayed his own amazement. The radio crackled with static before a voice came through clearly. "Base, this is Ridge Team Alpha. The bottle island. Well, sir, there's nothing left of it. Direct hit, center mass. I've got glass fragments scattered in a 3-foot radius around the fence post. I've been in the Army for 18 years, and I've never seen anything like this shot." Sarah stood slowly, ejecting the spent cartridge and setting the rifle safely aside with practiced movements. Her hands weren't shaking. Her breathing was calm and controlled. She looked exactly like someone who had just accomplished something she'd done 1,000 times before. Though everyone present knew they had just witnessed something that perhaps only a handful of people in the world could achieve. "I believe you gentlemen owe me $4,000, she said quietly, her voice carrying no hint of arrogance or triumph. But nobody was thinking about money anymore. They were thinking about the fact that they had just witnessed a shot that would become legendary, a demonstration of marksmanship that existed at the very pinnacle of human capability. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" Martinez finally managed to ask, his voice filled with genuine awe rather than skepticism. Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving at the compound, and it transformed her entire face. "I told you. My family taught me, but there's something I didn't mention earlier." She reached into her gear bag and pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and calculations accumulated over decades. "My grandfather was William Mitchell. He held the American long-range shooting record from 1,967 to 1,988. My father, David Mitchell, was the Army's top sniper instructor at Fort Benning for 12 years before he was killed in action in Afghanistan. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the group. And me? I've been the civilian long-range shooting champion for the Western United States for the past 6 years running. My personal record before today was 3,200 meters. What I just did was actually within my normal capabilities, though I'll admit the conditions were challenging. The revelation hit the assembled soldiers like a physical blow. They had just witnessed not a fluke or a lucky shot, but a demonstration by one of the most skilled marksmen in the country. Sarah Mitchell wasn't some diversity hire or political appointment. She was a shooter whose capabilities exceeded those of anyone in their unit. "Why didn't you tell us this from the beginning?" Thompson asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because you wouldn't have learned anything that way," Sarah replied simply. "You needed to see past your assumptions before you could see what was actually in front of you. Now you know that skill, dedication, and expertise can come in any package. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one you underestimate." Colonel Harrison stepped forward, and for the first time since Sarah had arrived, he was smiling. "Lieutenant Mitchell, welcome to Delta Force. I think these gentlemen have learned a valuable lesson today about making assumptions." He turned to face the assembled soldiers. "And as for the rest of you, I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to come up with $4,000. As the morning sun climbed higher over Fort Bragg, the dynamics of the elite sniper unit had fundamentally shifted. Sarah Mitchell had earned more than just money from her impossible shot. She had earned the respect and admiration of some of the military's most elite warriors. More importantly, she had reminded them all that true skill recognizes no boundaries of gender, appearance, or expectation. The beer bottle might have been shattered into 1,000 pieces, but the assumptions and prejudices of Delta Force's finest had been shattered just as completely. And in the mountains of North Carolina, a new legend was born, not just of an impossible shot, but of the quiet blonde woman who had proven that sometimes the most lethal weapon is the one your enemies never see coming.